Over what territory does the state rule? Where does its rule begin and end?
The answers to these all-important questions are often assumed toward granting the state unlimited control and power. Many Christians even build doctrines around misunderstood and misinterpreted passages of Scripture, where they render to Caesar whatever Caesar demands, with little thought regarding what God demands and determines. To make matters worse, as the world has become more atheistic and secularized, it has enabled a globalized culture of tyranny, where the state views itself and functions as a deity.
Today we're joined by Dr. Glenn Sunshine and Dr. Joe Rigney. Glenn Sunshine is the founder and president of Every Square Inch Ministries, is Professor Emeritus of History at Central Connecticut State University, Ministry Associate at Reflections Ministry, Senior Fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and co-host of the Theology podcast.
Glenn has taught a variety of Bible, history, and worldview seminars and courses to churches around the United States, Europe, Africa, and Asia, as well as leading church retreats, seminars, and renewal weekends. He teaches in the Colson Fellow Program and has been the content consultant for several worldview curricula.
An award-winning author, Glenn has published 10 books and numerous articles and book chapters on history, politics, theology, and culture online and on both sides of the Atlantic. His book, Slaying Leviathan, provides an excellent treatise of Protestant resistance theory and limited government.
Glenn and his wife Lynn have been married for over 40 years and have 2 married adult children. They live in South Bend, Indiana.
Dr. Joe Rigney is a Fellow of Theology at New St. Andrews College and author of the recent publication, The Sin of Empathy. Dr. Rigney's work explores the forces shaping our emotions and decisions, illuminating how courage can free us from fear's grip. Previously, he served as professor and president of Bethlehem College and Seminary, pastor at Cities Church, and teacher at Desiring God. An ever-curious generalist, he has a passion for teaching on topics from C.S. Lewis and Shakespeare to biblical theology and political philosophy. When he's not exploring ideas, Joe's coaching high school football, playing baseball with his 3 sons, or spending cherished time with his wife, Jenny. And now, to our conversation.
We the people of the United States, in order to serve their purpose, establish justice, liberty for ourselves and our posterity. We will
Welcome to Kings and Statesmen. My name is Lennox Kelefungwa. Alongside me is my formidable and brilliant co-host, David Shepard. Today we're joined by 2 special guests, Dr. Joe Rigney and Dr. Glenn Sunshine. Thank you for joining us today, gentlemen.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Today we're going to be speaking about limited government and the importance of this idea that we know as limited government. And this is specifically interesting in a time when Doge is doing its work and cleaning up house in many ways. But I think it's important for us to understand what this is in a holistic way. Of course, Glenn, you've written on this, and I'm interested in knowing from you, just where do you start with arguing for limited government? Where do we see the earliest conceptions of limited government?
Well, it really starts in a lot of ways with St. Augustine. And the key here is understanding the idea of original sin. Because of original sin, which infects everybody, including kings, no one can be trusted with absolute authority because everybody is corrupt and is corruptible.
Right.
And as a result, since no one can be trusted with absolute authority, you have to have limited government. This creates a situation where you have to have a system of checks and balances in place. And government has to be restricted in its power because no matter how you set it up, it will always try to overstep its bounds. It will always try to Well, look at the city of God. The key point in the city of God is that in the city of man, the only reality really is power. People are always after power. They're always after self-aggrandizement, these kinds of things, and they'll use force to get it. And this is the reality that we see. This is the effect, again, of original sin. And when you, as a result, government needs to be limited in its power. It needs to be restricted in its power in a Christian context.
Yeah.
And again, one of the things that we often mistake, we think the idea of checks and balances comes from the U.S. Constitution. It actually goes all the way back to people reflecting on Augustine. Since you can't trust anybody with absolute power, you can't trust anybody in government with all the government's power either. Right. So you have systems of divided government, checks and balances all the way back through the Middle Ages. Kings have courts. In every system, there are ways of dividing power up among different groups to try to prevent anybody from accumulating too much power. It's just fundamental, all through medieval political thought coming out of Augustine.
Yes, indeed. Joe, do you have anything you want to add to that?
I think the basic idea of different, reflecting on like the nature of institutions and the institutions that God has established for different purposes. So, to think in terms of, and in doing so, to do so in a way that it sounds, I think, like there's a wisdom argument to that. It's basically like, given the fact of original sin, we need to wisely restrict and tie some stuff down. But that doesn't necessarily specify these kinds of checks and balances or this particular arrangement, which I think Christian political philosophy has always had a kind of flexibility, allowing for variations, and I think that's a really important thing to recognize. And sometimes I think we try to elevate particular structures that have worked really well in one context and make them kind of the standard. But you could also think about it just in terms of sort of the basic institutions that God has established. So you have family, you have church or ecclesiastical government. So there would have been the priesthood in the Old Testament would be in that bucket, and then the civil magistrate. Right. And that each of these sort of are designed to accomplish certain ends and given certain tools to accomplish those ends. Yeah. And therefore, even among themselves, while they're all designed by God to promote His kingdom, to further the kingdom of God, and honor Him and do good to others. They have different tools to do that, and they ought to use those tools in concert with one another, respecting to some degree their relative jurisdictions, but it's not always hard and fast lines in that sense. There's an overlapping synergy in healthy societies between these different institutions, but that would that would include some measure of limitation. So like the Westminster Confession says that like Christ is the head of the church, right? Which was a way of differentiating from, say, the Roman Catholic Church, which says the Pope is the head of the Christ, head of the church, at least on earth, and gave him a certain kind of authority relative to the church. Here's a human who has relative authority to the church. And the Westminster Presbyterian said, no. Christ is the head of the church, and He's ordained governments, but they're subordinate and therefore have certain. So the basic kind of structures there are the family. Each of the different institutions has a representative disciplinary tool. The family has the rod. The church has the keys, and the state has the sword. And that's not the only tool available to them, right? But it's a representative tool that then means it's good for certain things and not good for other things. If you try to accomplish with the sword what God intended to be accomplished with the rod, which is effectively what America is doing. Like we abandon the family, fatherlessness, nation of bastards. Yes. We have this phenomenon, and then now we're like, hey, let's see if the police can figure this out. Right. Let's allow the criminal justice system to try to fix a family problem. It's trying to use a tool that's ill-suited to accomplish that end, and in that way distorts and causes a lot of other problems.
Yeah.
Joe's absolutely right in that if you're looking at an absolute sense, you look at things like family, religion, and government as different spheres that operate. And those are established by God right at the start. And it's interesting, if you look at the ancient world, you can see a lot of these things in operation. If you look, for example, at ancient Mesopotamia, there is a clear distinction between the religious bodies, the temples, and the kings, up to a point. And then suddenly the kings start declaring themselves representatives of God as a way of usurping some of that religious authority into their own hands. When you get to Rome, you've got all the various religions, but it's the emperor's job to sort of oversee them. And if there's a conflict within the religion, it's the emperor's job to mediate. That's one of the reasons why he's overseeing the Council of Nicaea. He's just performing his traditional role. So what you're seeing in Rome, in the Roman context, is sort of a breakdown of all these things, the exception being the family. Family continues to be independent. So what Augustine does in that context is really, well, the church is already moving in this direction, but what Augustine does in that context is he says, the proclamation that Christ is Lord, which is what got the early Christians in so much trouble, right, means a lot of different things, but when you dig deeper and look at the fundamental problem that we're facing, it's sin. And this is why government goes wrong. Yep. This is why the city of man is what it is. It's all about power. It's all about self-aggrandizement. It's all about, it's all about using force to enforce it. Interestingly enough, it is also all about tolerance, because in order to maintain peace in the society, to increase your wealth and your power and things like that for the elites, you've got to enforce tolerance. Because otherwise people are fighting among themselves and it weakens your power. Right. So it's all of these kinds of things that you've got to do. But the problem is, at its root, it's wrong, because you're loving the wrong thing. You're loving yourself. You're not loving God. And that is always going to lead you to a bad end. Right. So the problem is, you got to get to the root of the problem, its original sin, and you therefore can't trust this. So that's why I went the direction I went. It's because in the context of government specifically, that's what we're looking at with Augustine. He's the one who really sets the trajectory for the Western political tradition here. Right. But in an absolute sense, you're absolutely right. I mean, he's really reflecting on biblical ideas and things like that as well.
Yeah. How did this, I guess, moving from Augustine going along, how did political theology develop around this idea of limited government? And by the time we're coming to the Reformation, what did that look like? And I have a particular interest in the Anglicans as well, where it seems like some of those lines, at least in my mind, get blurred. Should a monarch be the head of the church? Those kinds of questions. How was that dealt with around that time?
Well, you actually have to go back further. You really have to look at the situation in the Middle Ages. The relationship between church and state is really complicated. I'm going to leave the Byzantine Empire off of this. Okay. I mean, because people get the Byzantines wrong all the time. I'm not even going to go there for now. But what ends up happening in Western Europe is that for quite a long time, the church and state are cooperating with each other. There isn't really a lot of competition going on. In a sense, the competition really gets started under Charlemagne. What happens there is, during the period prior to Charlemagne, the papacy wasn't really that significant an office in a lot of ways. It was really a political plum for Italian noble families. There was a lot of rivalries and things like that. They did perform some ecclesiastical functions, of course, but it was really a political prize in a lot of ways. And someone was elected pope, and some of his rivals actually tried to murder him. Charlemagne's troops rescued him. Then he was accused of all kinds of crimes, and he appealed to Charlemagne for judgment. Now, Charlemagne wasn't sure he really wanted to do this because he wasn't sure he had jurisdiction over this, but he ended up deciding the case. And that set a precedent that the emperor could judge the pope. The pope looked at this and said, that's not good. So on Christmas Day 800, he crowns Charlemagne emperor, which sets a precedent that the Pope is the one who makes the emperor. This begins the beginning of sort of the tug of war, actually, who's over the other. Sure. Charlemagne spent the rest of his reign basically showing the Pope that he was the one who was really in charge here. Okay, after Charlemagne, both the imperial office and the papal office go into a severe decline. As a matter of fact, the imperial office is lost within a few generations. Then in the 10th century, under Otto the Great, Otto I, the imperial office revives. Otto then goes down to Rome, cleans up the papacy, appoints a new pope, actually a really good one. And he and his successor, Otto II, and his successor, Otto III, they're very creative with their names, they appoint a series of good reforming popes. This sort of sets the precedent that the emperors are over the popes. The popes don't like that. And so they do their best to get themselves out from under the authority of the papacy. Under the authority of the emperor. And they begin making more and more exaggerated claims. Ultimately, they get themselves independent of the emperors. They start making more and more exaggerated claims over papal authority over all earthly authorities. And really, the rest of medieval history, in a lot of ways, politically, can be summarized as the tug of war between the popes and the emperors. Okay. Now, you need that background when you get to the Reformation. Because what happens in the Reformation is you get rid of the Pope.
Right.
Okay, so how then do you, now up to this point, like I said, there's a rivalry, but there's always the understanding that the states are somehow connected to the papacy. The church is still there, it's still important. Bishops and things like that, part of all governments. All the kings have bishops as part of their administrative apparatus and all that. Now suddenly you get rid of the papacy. How do you govern church-state relations? We have no precedent for this. We don't understand how this goes. What happens in all Protestant states is they establish state churches without exception. So in Germany, in the Holy Roman Emperor, you have state empire. Within the Protestant states, you have state churches under the electoral Saxony, under the elector and all of that. They've got their state church. In Geneva, you've got a state church. Calvin, when he set up the Constitution of Geneva, made the pastors civil employees. Calvin, in principle, was fireable on 2 weeks' notice. Actually, wasn't even 2 weeks' notice. I think he was, he could be dismissed by the state government. That's universal. So it's not surprising when you get to the Anglican context that you're going to set up a state church. Yeah. Now, the way it happens in England is a little bit unusual. And specifically the idea that the king is also the head of the church. That goes back actually to a historical argument that's made by Thomas Cromwell. The argument there, you have to understand the Reformation, the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, the belief was that the truth about anything was found in its origin. Okay, so when Henry wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon to marry Anne Boleyn, he couldn't get the Pope to agree to do this. Part of the reason he couldn't get the Pope to agree to do this is that the Pope was currently a prisoner of Charles V, who was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. Okay, so this was not going to work. This is not going to work. What Cromwell did is he said, okay, let's take a look at the history of the church in England. Christianity came with Rome, but then it was driven out by the Saxon invasions. It was reintroduced into England from the north by the Irish. The Irish convert Scotland through Iona, and then they push south. And so York and things like that were Irish foundations. The Synod of then after that, the Roman Church arrives, and then at the Synod of Whitby, they decide to go with Roman practices rather than Celtic practices. But the Celtic Church was, in technical terms, autocephalous. It was self-headed. It wasn't part of really the Roman world. And we know this because as late as the 13th century, the Pope was urging England to bring Ireland under the authority of the papacy. So England was founded not under Roman authority. The Church of England was founded not under Roman authority. So in its origin, remember the Renaissance, in its origin, it's not under Rome because it was founded by this autocephalous church. And therefore, Rome doesn't have any authority over the Church of England. And what that would mean is that the head of the Church of England should probably be the King of England. Henry really liked that argument. Yeah. And that allows him to divorce Catherine and Mary Anne. Yeah. So that was the argument. That was why, that was what justified in Henry's mind the divorce and the establishment of the Anglican Church. Henry was not a Protestant. Yeah. Henry was a Catholic minus the Pope. Mm-hmm. But that was how we got there.
Sure. Yeah, and I think just moving along even more, it seems like over time there was this robust discourse around political theology, political theory, that I suppose was really affected by the Enlightenment. What do you believe we most need to understand in our current context about political structure, about limited government, that you think has been lost by and large?
Well, there was a great deal of Christian political theology that was developing through the 18th century. Already by the late 17th century, it was starting to be secularized a little bit. But the founding of America, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, all of these things were products of this process, this development of Christian political theology. With the French Revolution, this all got cut off, because with the French Revolution, you get the first attempt at a purely secular state in history. I don't know of any other attempt ever. And the results were frankly disastrous. And what that does is it really effectively cuts off the ongoing development of Christian political theology. You still get things. You get Kuyper, you get people like that who continue to do work in it, but it no longer is really central to what's going on in Western political theory. So we've got to call it political theory now, no longer political theology. And instead, secular ideas or a secular approach to politics becomes the dominant way of looking at politics. It's cut off from its theological roots. And the problem with that is that once you eliminate Christianity from your political thinking, you're living on borrowed time, because everything that depends on Christianity will erode and eventually disappear. So all of our ideas about limited government, all of our ideas about fundamental rights, all of our ideas about liberty, all of these things are going to disappear. When you eliminate the Christian roots, the Christian fruit can't last. Yeah. And we're now 200 plus years into this experiment, and what we're seeing is the serious erosion and the near disappearance of a lot of these things, especially in Europe, less so over here, but it's here as well.
Right. Joe, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah. So I think part of what gets lost is that sort of infinite reference point that God has to anchor all human institutions and order them properly, and that all human institutions ought to be ordered to the honor and glory of God. And if you don't have that, so if you have a couple of centuries or a millennium or more of Christianity being the main ingredient in European social life, right? And then all of a sudden you try to say, well, not that, but we're going to try to maintain all of these other fruits of that world. Eventually they start to go rotten, and people don't know why, and they go rotten at different paces in different places. Yeah. But then as a result, I think today you have a lot of Christians who think that basically the norms that obtained, particularly in the West, particularly in America, say of the last, like basically I think from the 1950s on, America tried to do their own secular experiment, like an overt one. And because that's what most people, that everybody alive today thinks in those terms, they think that was a sustainable arrangement. And so a lot of the like current debates among those who are maybe say, would be classical liberals, or those who are trying to kind of rethink even more fundamentally certain things, all of those kind of debates are basically like, this experiment failed, but we don't know what to do. Like, how do we go? Can you go back? Do you have to go forward? Does going forward mean recovering certain elements of our Christian past? Can you have is it possible to have a sustainable society, a sustainable nation with the kind of religious and moral diversity that ours has? Like, is that actually even possible? And I think people get really uncomfortable with that kind of question, but it's the sort of thing that, when John Adams famously said, right, that the Constitution is fit for immoral and religious people, it's unfit for any other. Like, you can't, and yet we're still trying to, sort of use this constitutional document when we manifestly do not have that religious and moral people any longer. And obviously the Constitution has become flexible and has all of a sudden absorbed, it's gone through its own series of renovations, multiple sort of constitutional reboots over America's history. It's like, where do you go from there if you want to have something that's not revolutionary in the French sense, that would overthrow any like radical overthrow is going to be disruptive and harmful and destructive. God may bring that as a form of judgment, but you shouldn't aim for that, right? We aim for reformation, we aim for revival, we aim for that kind of change. But it's like, but in order to have any sort of reformation and revival depends upon knowing what you're aiming at. And so you may look at right now and go, well, we can't have a Christian nation because we don't have we don't have enough Christians to do it. Say someone said that. Like, okay, that's fine, but you should know that that's what you want. Right. And I think even that, for a lot of, sort of Reformed evangelicals or just evangelicals in general, is a hard sell, because we think that we can sort of have a secular society that's a little bit pregnant. Right? Like, it's like we want secularism, but like when it's just, 3 months and starting to show. We don't want secularism's that baby that secularism bears is actually what we lived through over the last 10 years with manifest bureaucratic tyranny and insanity. And there's a lot of Christians who just want to rewind the tape just a little bit and push pause. And it's like, that's not how this works. You actually have to have more fundamental. And so for me, the basic political thing is all human institutions need to acknowledge the lordship of Christ. Right. They need to acknowledge God. They need to acknowledge Christ. All authority has been given to him. And then all of the particulars get worked out in light of that fact. Right. And there's a whole bunch of different ways that it could be done. That there's wisdom comes into play there big time to say, like, this is a good way to do it. That's a good way to do it. Not everybody has to do it identically. Prudence is kind of the statesman's fundamental thing that he has to have, which is adapting means to that end. So get the end in view, and then what kind of people do you have? What's their history? Where are they now? What's going on? What are the tools available to you? And you do the best you can with what you have in order to move toward greater faithfulness. But that's the basic political problem, is first you have to get clear on, like, there's something we're aiming at, a more righteous, a more pious, a more just society, according to God's standards. And if you don't even think that's worth aiming at, then this is why Christians often kneecap each other. Because you say, I want to have a Christian nation, and you have another Christian saying, but I don't. No, that's not what we're after. And now if we can't even agree, what chance do we have to persuade a wider populace that would be beneficial?
I find myself thinking of Christopher Hitchens,
right,
who wants to be culturally Christian without really Christians, which you simply can't do. But in a sense, he's on the right track. Right. He does recognize the importance of Christianity for the culture. Right. The problem, of course, is that you can't use God for your ends, and that ends up, you can't have a Christian culture without Christians. The one thing he doesn't really kind of grasp.
You put first, so the Lewis insight of you put first thing first and you get second things thrown in. You put second things first, which a godly society would be a second thing. And if you put that in the first place, you lose both. You don't get either. Right. And that's what the atheists like Dawkins and others that's what they're missing is. But what's interesting is that they actually discovered it. For a while, within Christendom, it's possible to mock Christ.
Yeah.
Right. Because you think, oh, the fruit will just be there. Right. And then it's all of a sudden when you see, well, take Christ away and eventually the bill comes due, that all of a sudden they start going, well, wait a minute, I liked Christmas carols. Right. His thing was I liked Christmas carols.
Yeah. It was Dawkins, not Hitchens.
Yeah. Right. It was, but it's like, I liked Christmas carols and I don't want mosques. Yeah. And he's trying to filter this through, but I don't want to be a racist because in England to be against the importation, the immigration of vast majority of Pakistanis is to make one a racist. I don't want to be a racist exactly, but I want Christmas carols, not the minaret. Yeah. And it's like, well, you don't get that if you don't have Christ.
Exactly.
That's the Christmas carols came from somewhere, and you cut a root of a tree and then are still wanting that fruit to grow.
Sure.
So one phrase I really like that Pastor Doug uses is that all laws impose some form of morality, and understanding that when our government was established with the separation of church and state, that was principally due to the government overreach into the church at the time of the Founding Fathers. What would you gentlemen say to where we're at today as a society and perhaps the lack of the church's involvement in helping form moral laws? And should there be more involvement in that regard?
Yeah, I think that the church has largely become secularized, and it's done this in two different directions. If you're looking at the liberal churches, nobody has a problem with the liberal churches being involved in politics because the liberal churches have nothing but politics to offer.
Right.
Whatever is the flavor of the day on the left is what the liberal churches support, and you'll notice nobody complains about people on the left campaigning in churches or getting endorsements from pastors and things like that. It's only when it happens on the right that it becomes an issue. But I would argue that a lot of evangelical churches have effectively become secularized too. But it's a totally different kind of secularization. At its root, what secularization says is that if you want to be religious, you can just keep it to yourself. And this is, or to put it differently, religion and government should be kept separate. The church should not influence the state shouldn't influence the church. In principle, this is the way it goes. But that turns into religion should not have a role in public life. Mm-hmm. And therefore, if you've got a religion, keep it to yourself. The evangelical church, by and large, has adopted a secular gospel, which says that salvation is about you and Jesus. It's about you getting your sins forgiven so you go to heaven. There's not much more to the evangelical gospel than that. It doesn't say anything about the lordship of Christ. It may talk about personal morality. It may talk about a hot button issue like abortion, but it doesn't have anything to say beyond that. And I suspect that the only reason abortion is an issue is because it's got a certain amount of political cachet to it. For many people, not all of them, but for many people. We've effectively secularized the gospel because we've reduced it to a privatized faith. As a result, the church, the theologically conservative people in the church have nothing to say to the culture. They have nothing to say to the wider world. They have nothing to say about politics, about morality, or anything like that. And when they try to say it, they roll over really quickly when there's opposition. Same-sex marriage, there was opposition to same-sex marriage until Obergefell, and as soon as Obergefell passed, people said, oh, well, it's legal. Okay, then. And suddenly the numbers reversed. And it's like, oh yeah, okay, everybody's supporting it now. They didn't support it just before. They suddenly started supporting it right after. How much of an opposition was that really? You know, this is the way we roll. So the secularization is really critical within the church.
Right.
Now, again, there are exceptions within the evangelical church broadly, and thankfully within the Reformed world, the conservative Reformed world, there are serious exceptions to this. But by and large, this is the state of American Christianity.
I want to hear you riff on that a little bit more.
Yeah, so when it comes to the church's role, I think, you know, making distinctions between something like the institutional church, whose main task is, you know, preaching the word, administering the sacraments. And within the preaching of the word is sort of establishing the basic frameworks, so the sorts of things that would be in your confession of faith. What is law? Would be, you know, law, gospel would be a part of that. The Lordship of Christ would be a part of that. And so you would be trying to establish sort of the baseline of what God expects everybody to do, and the sort of things that you can say, thus saith the Lord about. Right. Okay? So to the degree that it's a thus saith the Lord, I want institutional church, I want pastors saying that. And part of what they then need to say is that there needs to be a whole lot of Christians engaged in a whole lot of other things that aren't that. Right. So we need both Christian statesmen, but then also Christian political philosophers and Christian economists. You know, one of the things that Lewis commended in his day, and I don't know that it would work quite as well. Although when I think about my own work on leadership, there's a way that this paradigm works. He says we need less books on Christianity and more books on politics or economics or whatever from a Christian, where the Christianity is assumed. Right? So it's not a book about, you know, here's the Christian thing, but it's the Christianity's assumed, and now you're just doing all the application. Of course God is real, and of course Christ is Lord, and of course, that sort of, in the same way that the secularists, right, every biologist just assumes evolution and then does all of his, you know, experiments. And that's actually in a way of assuming the center. When we talk about assuming the center, it's a way of, you assume this is the way the world is. Now there's a place for actually making the argument for your baseline assumptions. But part of what's needed is to develop Christian communities. This would be both church communities, but also like educational ones, like what we're after, where the Christianity is sort of baked in so deep that you can actually argue from it and not argue for it anymore. Right. And then, so so if the church means the people of God writ large, like just the people of God, then I want lots of the church doing that sort of thing. But the institutional church needs to stay with, like, it has a vital role to play in worship, word sacrament. That's the fundamental role of the pastors. What gets tricky in our day is because so many of the political issues violate fundamental moral laws. So in a Christian, under Christendom, it was possible, like under Christendom, it was possible for churches to say, it's like, hey, we don't get involved in what the relative tax rate should be, or those kind of, like, the pastor doesn't need to have a strong opinion and shouldn't be preaching on it necessarily. That's like, we let our Christian statesmen sort through the application of our basic principles. But it's because we have a shared notion of, like, where are we going? What kind of society do we have? Who is God? Where is his law? All of those things are like the framework, and then all of our debates happen within that. And I think Western Europe and America basically had something like that. It was shared ends, and the debates were all about means, some of which were stupid. Right? So, like, in other words, you have debates where it's like, hey, we're all after the same thing. The way you want to get there is stupid. It's folly, and it will be counterproductive and useless, and so we shouldn't do your idea, but we're all operating in the same, basically, moral and theological universe. What we have now is a situation where you have two fundamentally different moral universes, where up is down and down is up, right is wrong and good is evil, and all of those sort of things. And in that context, pastors can't cede and say, well, hey, we're just going to stay out of this. Because it's like, no, murder's wrong. And when I preached a sermon one time on, it's the passage in Mark where John the Baptist tells Herod, you can't have your brother's wife. And the basic argument I made is, I said, to the degree that we're talking about moral issues that I can find in the 10 Commandments, like if it's a violation of one of the 10, you should expect your pastor to say something about it directly, because he should do it like John did. You may not. Right. This is wrong. You may not. And that includes the personal morality side. You may not have your brother's wife, but also includes the you may not murder the babies or trans the kids. To the degree that it's about here's a good and here's a good, here's a good thing, here's a good thing. And the debates are about like, how do we do these with the trade-offs, right? It's like, is it good to steward well the world that we've been given, sort of environmental sort of things? Yes. And is it good for us to allow people to freedom to make money? Yes, both of those are good. And your policies are going to try to navigate that wisely. It's like the pastor doesn't need to have strong opinions and there doesn't need to be a sermon series on it. But we live in a society where you walk through the 10 and you're like, man, we are just breaking every single one of those. Right. And therefore it is the role of the pastor to teach his people, you may not, you may not, you may not, or you must, you must, you must. We have to respect marriage. We have to protect life. We have to respect other people's property. These are just basics and then some of you need to rise to the calling of going and applying that in all sorts of ways in the civil sphere and in the business sphere and so forth.
Yeah. Do you think the church has lost its voice in speaking to those things because of a fear of legalism on one hand?
I think one of the problems is that people think when Christians think of morality, they think there's a thing called Christian morality.
Right.
And so they think of they treat Christianity like an ideology that's sort of this. I have a way of thinking about the world that I impose on a reality that's like Plato, and our debates are basically power struggles. I want to impose my Christian morality on the world, and you want to impose your progressive morality on the world, but we all both agree that it's Plato. Right? That's the common thread is like, we can mold it whichever way we want. Right. And some of what Christians have lost is a sense of like, no, there is no such thing as Christian morality. We speak that way as a kind of shorthand. Right. But God's law is God's law. It's universal. It's creational. It's imposed. And it's oversees everybody's under it, whether you're a Christian or not. They may be breaking it, but the law of God is something that's universally applicable, and Christians ought to act like it in their own mind. Yeah. And therefore, when because all law, like you said, all law is imposed. Like there's no such thing as we shouldn't impose morality. It's the only thing you can impose by law. Yeah, exactly. And so if you're going to impose it, it needs to be the one that actually exists. It's the standard, it's the law of God that has to get imposed.
Yeah, I think to take that one step further, I think one of the problems we have with losing kids in college and stuff like that is we treat it like it's an ideology, but we also never explain it. We explain what to do, what not to do, but we never explain the why.
The reasons beneath the
reasons. And fundamentally, I think we forget that God's laws are there for our good.
Right.
That if you do this, it results in the best ends.
Right.
The results are always better if you do things God's way. And what that means is that if we take seriously the liberals' favorite commandment, love your neighbor, which they read their own way, the best way to love your neighbor is to promote God's law.
Right.
Because God's law will result in the best ends for your neighbor. Right. It's not to let your neighbor do whatever your neighbor thinks is good for them, because your neighbor is probably wrong. Right. So actually promoting God's standards is the way to best love your neighbor. And I don't think we actually think about it that way. We don't recognize that, and that's why we don't actually support what we say we believe.
And I think that there's also where the confusion of the institutions comes into play, because the state, or because the church is tasked with preaching the gospel, which includes the law. You preach the law and then you preach the gospel. You bring to bear, God's already working on their conscience. You already know that before you get there, God's already there. Right. Pressing on them, and you're trying to bring to bear the word to really press that home, and then you offer them the hope of the gospel. A number of Christians have said, well, we want to preach the gospel and we don't want to impose things on people. We want to leave it open. And it's like, but that's what the civil magistrate's for, and we fail to reckon the way that law teaches. Like one of the first use of the law is that it's a teacher, it's a pedagogical use. And that's what, when you mentioned Obergefell, it taught. Right? And people learned, right? The law said sodomy makes a marriage. Yeah. You can make a marriage out of sodomy. And so a bunch of people said, well, I guess you can. And they just went along with it. And then when the next phase came along and said, and therefore, if men can become women in marriage, which is what sodomite marriage is, then men can become women in general. And so then you had the trans thing, and everybody went, now that makes sense under a legal regime, which is teaching that perpetually. And Christians have to recover like law teaches. And so we don't wait until everybody agrees. We have to get universal consensus about what marriage is before we can reimpose that marriage is one man, one woman, one lifetime. Right. No, you do it because that's part of, like, one of the roles of the state is to teach what is true and what is good. Right. And so we want our laws to teach what's true and to govern accordingly. So, and Christians are uncomfortable with that because we don't recognize what the law is for. We think the only thing it's for is like convicting the individual sinner of their need for Jesus. Right. But that actually, that's the way that like cultural Christianity, and then so when Christians celebrated the demise of cultural Christianity, which some did, like they thought cultural Christianity's gone, good riddance, Bible Belt religion's over, good riddance. What they thought was, good, we're done with all that hypocrisy and that nominalism and things like that. Failing to recognize that even that hypocrisy and that nominalism was hypocrisy is the testimony that the tribute that vice pays to virtue. It at least acknowledges the standard as it breaks it sneakily. Sure. Right. And the acknowledgement of the standard meant that the evangelist has something to work on. Mm-hmm. Everybody had, like that society as a whole in law and custom is putting the same kind of pressure that God is putting on them in their conscience. Mm. And now an evangelist, this is another Lewis point, the evangelist has something to work on. And that was true even of, like Lewis thought that about ancient paganism because it had a concept of sin, it had a concept of guilt, and that's what those sacrifices were for. We made Zeus mad. We better offer a bull, right? And so at least had a notion of you've displeased the gods, and therefore when Paul comes in and says, actually there's only one, and yes you have, you've really displeased him, and his wrath hangs over you, that was comprehensible. Yeah. Modern secular society has inverted everything, and now what the cultural Christianity, good riddance people fail to recognize is what would happen if you catechized a generation, if you catechized a society into thinking that Christian morality wasn't just inconvenient, but was actually evil. Right. Christian morality is evil. So you're saying I can't do that, and therefore you're a bad person because you believe in the law. Well, people absorb that message, and so now when you try to come to give them the gospel, Jesus forgives you your sins. They go, what do you mean? Yeah. I'm the good person. Right. I'm the good. I'm the social justice warrior. I've done all the good things, and so I don't need forgiveness. What are you talking about? It doesn't make sense, and that's part of the way that the institution of the state and of broader civil society, businesses, and so forth, promote and encourage the work of the church in its evangelizing capacity, because they're setting up what my friend Timon was supposed to be here, and we're going to get to talk to him, right? But cultural conditions conducive to conversion. Like they set up the framework, the plausibility structures in which the gospel makes sense. Yeah. Otherwise, the evangelist has to do everything. He's got to go back to square one and lay this whole foundation, which is a much bigger process. Yeah. And I think a lot of what we're facing today is that a whole bunch of Christians relied upon Christendom for a whole bunch of discipleship, and they didn't know it. Right? Like Christendom was discipling their kids. Certainly. Yeah. It was discipling their neighbors. It was discipling them in the law of God. So that then when they said, hey, why don't you come to church with me? Or, hey, the evangelist coming through town, there's a tent revival, right? Revivalism is built on, it only works in a cultural Christian context. Absolutely. Because the sense of sin's already there, and the evangelist is just going to come in and try to press the point home and give the gospel. But everybody knows the good Lord and the good book, and that I haven't lived up to it. That actually fostered evangelism. Same reason that I don't have even Anglicanism, which may not be my wisdom calls and things like that on church structure. But it was in Europe that you had all of these revival movements. That you had the awakenings, the renewals of. So when some American Christians look at the European context and they say, "Oh, look what the state churches and look what Christendom did there. Look how bad it is." I go, it had 1,000 years is a pretty good run. Yeah. For any kind of basic structure, that's pretty good. And within it, where did those great awakenings come from? Where did those revivals come from? Where did the missionary movements come from? Yeah. They were renewal movements within Christendom. Sure. And so I want to get back to a context in which there's all of the wood has been laid because of Christendom and cultural Christianity, and all that needs to happen is the fire falls.
Yeah. Now, in mine, I now have men like Jordan Peterson, Tom Holland. I'd even throw Richard Dawkins in that as well, who I think they're kind of resorting to the Christian heritage of the West as the means through which they are now curious about the rest of what Christianity has to say. And so there's a sense in which, I believe it's not all dead or not all gone. It could be the occasion for yet another revival of sorts, It's a good point.
So I think that the big thing for those guys is they would have to repent of their evolutionism.
Right, yes.
Like the deepest habit of their minds, like the deepest commitment they have is the evolutionary narrative. That's their big story. And so even all the good things that Christianity, which they're now able to acknowledge, like, oh yeah, in the scope of history and the evolution of societies, the Christians brought in these liberty and free inquiry and free speech and all these things that they love, but they're still trying to fit Christianity into a billions of years evolutionary framework, and they want to. And so it's like this funny thing where, like, on their framework, what they want to do is they want to go back.
Right.
But the point is, in their framework is like, no, you don't go back. Like you evolve forward. You're like, it's improvements, right? We're getting better. We're getting better adapted. And I suppose they might say, well, there's certain maladaptions, and that's why things go extinct. Certain things go extinct because they become maladapted, and that's what we're having. But they're still trying to fit the Christian story into the evolutionary story. And so a guy like Peterson, I think, is really interesting on this, is because he can recognize that Christianity has this potency to it, the story of Christ and things like that. The Bible is this amazing thing, but he's trying to squeeze it into his Jungian evolutionary stuff. And at some level, but he recognizes the stakes, which is why he can get pretty emotional about it, because it's like, but what if he did? Like, what if he walked out of that tomb? Like, what if that happened? All of a sudden, it's like, then anything might happen. Like all of a sudden, the world is very different, and an entire reconstruction of his whole world would be required, and that's terrifying.
Of course.
One of the things I find interesting, when I was teaching in a secular school, and I watched lots of changes in the culture of the students over the 27 years I was at this school. But one of the things I found really fascinating was that when we were dealing with moral issues and questions of that sort, as came up in class, the question came up often, okay, they believed X. How did they know that? They turned everything, for a while, they were turning everything into an epistemological question. Then it turned into, different people had different opinions on this, so there's no way really to know the answer. As if different opinions really, at that point, I didn't know of any flat earthers, or I would have pointed out that there were flat earthers out there that have different opinions on the shape of the earth. But it was almost as if different opinions disqualified anybody from being right. And then it shifted entirely to the world you were talking about, where there is a right answer, we've got it, and if you disagree with us, you're evil.
Right.
It's the progression. I just found really interesting, over time, because it didn't happen all at once. It was just sort of this gradual step-by-step thing as the culture was shifting.
Well, and it's interesting. I read something similar from an academic, I think, who works, and it's basically the divided mind of the student. So that, like those last two that you mentioned, sort of the skepticism of any right answers because of the differences, and the need, therefore, for kind of a relativism and a tolerance of all opinions. That's sort of like the intellectual operating system. Like, so if you ask them the question, like, is there absolute morality? No. They're going to give all the relativistic answers. But then all it takes is for you to pick whatever the issue of the day is. Right. And then you can all of a sudden trigger the little Pharisee in there. Like you can trigger, like the moralist will just come flying out, and it's almost like there's this like this division of like the intellectual. What they're repeating their catechism. There is no absolute morality. We're relativists. We need to tolerate everybody. But then there's also this like moral jihadist in there. That all you have to do is be like, and so okay, so everybody can do. So a society that decided to execute homosexuals. That's just different opinions, right? And all of a sudden it's like, here comes the moralist flying out. And then you go, and if you try to like, what the challenge is, those two sides of them can't even talk to each other.
I had that happen with me on climate change once.
Yes, right.
And I just simply pointed out that I remember every climate disaster predicted since the 70s, and none of them happened.
None of them happened, right?
So, so excuse me for being skeptical. And they're like, how can you say that? I actually used to do a game with them. I would tell them, okay, how many of you believe in absolute truth? No hands go up. I said, I don't believe you. We're on a field trip to New York. I was in Connecticut. It was a close trip. We go up to the top of the Empire State Building. You're enjoying the view. It's 11:30. You want to have lunch. There's a food truck at the bottom. There's a long line, however, at the elevator to get down there. You want to get down before noon because you figure the place is going to be overwhelmed by then. You have two choices. You can take your chances and wait and go down on the elevator, or you can step off the observation deck. If you step off the observation deck, I guarantee you'll get to the food truck before anybody else. How many of you do that? Well, nobody does, because they know absolutely they're going to hit the ground. And they're not going to like to stop at the end of the fall. So, and say, okay, now, how many of you, when I ask the question of absolute truth, were thinking about that? No, we weren't. Yeah, right, because the laws of physics are absolute. Okay, so you were thinking about morality, right? Yeah, okay, yeah, we were thinking about morality. I don't believe you either. Same field trip. You're walking along Fifth Avenue. Traffic is whizzing by in both directions. You see a little old lady trying to cross the street, loaded packages and things like that. You have three choices. You can help her across the street, do the Boy Scout thing. You can ignore her or walk past her, or you can shove her into traffic. How many of you even thought of the third option? Why not? Because you know absolutely that it is wrong. So you can play games like this to sort of catch them.
And to draw it out, because it is like that actually, the hope in that as a Christian is that like their outrage at whatever they're outraged, even though the outrage, they might be outraged at something that God approves of, right? Like they're, the fact of their outrage testifies to the pressure of the conscience. Like it's still in there. It may be seared, distorted, and twisted, but like they're still human, and they're and whatever their intellectual operating system, whatever their ideology tells them, they have to live in a world that God made. And so it's like you just go in knowing that.
It's a Romans 1 concept that God has written on the hearts of man, his law.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, I come from a context where statism is assumed. I can't tell you how many times I've stood in front of even Christian audiences and I ask them a sort of moral question, and their first rebuttal to my question would be, okay, but what does the government have to say about this? Or like that's all is the assumed position. It's like, well, that's not what we're dealing with here. We're talking about morality in absolute terms. And that, which is why I think it's important to underscore the fact that it's God who determines the definitions of good and evil, right? Not the state. And there's a sense in which, just circling us back to limited government, I think that's the basis of it. I think thus saith the Lord is the statement that completely limits what the state can and cannot do. Now, trying to get into some of the details on this, I wanted us to kind of talk about crimes and sin in relation to each other. What's the difference between the two? And why are those two concepts very important to distinguish as not the same thing?
Yeah, so I would get to a crime to sin distinction by kind of the classic Reformed doctrine of the two kingdoms, which is not the church and the state. People often confuse and think that the two kingdom, when Protestant Christians say two kingdoms, they mean the kingdom of the church and the kingdom of the state. That's a distortion of the doctrine. Right. The actual doctrine is the doctrine of the inner man and the outer man. So there's the form of the conscience. That's the spiritual, what Calvin called the spiritual government of the spiritual kingdom. And in that forum, it's just you and God. There's no mediation. It's just everybody stands naked before God. That's the inner man. The outer man is like the realm in which we live and move and have our being in the world, in the temporal kingdom, the world God made. And in that sense, the family is in the temporal kingdom, the state is in the temporal kingdom, but so is the visible church. All of these are in the temporal kingdom. And that, I think, gives you grounds to think, and I think this is just a basic, the biblical distinction would be the inner man versus the outer man. When Paul talks that way, the outer man's wasting away, but the inner man's being renewed day by day, you have this sort of like soul-body kind of distinction. But the body includes your intentional actions. It's not just like food and drink. It's also like the things you do in public. That allows you to distinguish between things that only God can see in the inner forum and things that everybody else can see in the outer forum. And when it comes to the external forum, that's the jurisdiction in which the various governments, the family, the church, and the state, actually have something to do, right? They can actually, and they can do so. This was I think the genius of the Reformation on this and putting these biblical pieces together. They can compel or restrict your behavior without coercing your conscience, that inner man, right? So you're free to believe whatever you want inside your head, right? You're before God, you stand on your own 2 feet. Like, conscience is bound to the word of God, that kind of classic reformational line. Right. But that still means that if you try to do something destructive to society, to social order, to this family or to this church or to this nation, these governments have been instituted by God in order to restrain sin and evil, or to restrain crime and evil, and to promote what is true and good in the various ways they can. So that would be the basic, and this is why I think you can distinguish, as Jesus does, between adultery and adultery in the heart. So a man who lusts has committed adultery in the heart, okay? But should that be a crime? Well, no, because you don't have access to you can't get at it, and so you shouldn't try to police it. You've got no jurisdiction there. That's between them and God. But if someone commits adultery in fact, that's something that's potentially, like the state could do something about that and say, we're going to have civil penalties if you violate your marriage oath, like they have they did in Israel and they have to this day. So those sort of things, that would be the basic way I'd get there.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that's important to distinguish. And I kind of want to start to apply this a little bit further. So Joe, I want to throw the question at you. Should we have speed limits? And should we have consequences for violating those speed limits? In that same regard. I mean, the argument would be, well, if you drive beyond the speed limit, you become an imminent threat to the public around you, and therefore, to prevent that from happening, that needs to be upheld and punished when violated.
Yeah, I think that's a perfectly legitimate application. I think that it would be on analogy with respect to other people's life and property. Would be kind of the basic moral duty. And then like in Israel, when you had laws, the two that come to mind are the laws about parapets. If you have a roof, you need to put a parapet up. And if you don't, then you're liable if somebody falls off your roof because they would sit up there. Or a law about if you have an ox who gores someone and whatever, and if he's been in the habit of goring, then it's even worse. Those kind of laws those are applications of you need to have regard for, love your neighbor by having regard for his life and property, and therefore the state has an interest in saying, hey, we've determined, and there could be wise and foolish versions of this. So the fact that it's lawful doesn't mean that like every traffic law is wise. Right. And so maybe that's actually a really key question I talk about with my students a lot. Is there a certain distinguishing between laws that are lawful, meaning they're in principle in bounds. They accord with the law of God.
There's a moral undertone.
There's a moral undercurrent that you're tied to the law of God. And so you have this power. And then the wise use of that law. And so I would distinguish between a righteous law, which is the first category, and a good law. And I know it seems a little bit weird. What's a good law? A good law is a righteous law that's wisely applied. Right? So a righteous law means it accords with God's law. And a good law is one that's both accords and it's fitting and appropriate and wisely applied. So there could be traffic laws. I can imagine traffic laws that would be stupid.
Right.
And I would say that's not a good law.
Parking tickets, pictures of your car going through a stop sign or something.
So there could be things like that 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 would be debatable. It's like, this is a that you have that power and authority and you're using it badly. I would actually put some of the COVID stuff in this category. Like, in principle, I would say, does the state have if you actually had a plague and say, 50% of the people who contracted it died, does the state have the lawful authority to try to regulate movements and stuff in order to get a handle on that? I think sure. Like, that's one of the things that they're there for. But if you were to use that power to regulate everybody's behavior, including the healthy, right. In the face of a plague that 99% of people survive, or whatever the numbers were, that especially those, it's like all of a sudden you're using just like someone could say with a parent, can you spank your kids? Is that a lawful power? Sure. For disobeying, yeah. But if you command them to do something ridiculous and then punish them for it, like, yes, that's a righteous power that you have, and that was a wicked use of it. That was an unlawful use of that power, or a bad use of that power because it was applied in the wrong way. So I think traffic laws are a good example of something that, yes, that's a state lawful state power.
What about laws in particular that the government has instituted to frame, say, like local municipalities, so like CUPs, AUPs, where the government basically says, we're going to designate this part of town for this. And I know in my context and previous work history as like property manager doing stuff, it's been difficult for individuals to go and pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness because the government's saying, no, you can't actually do that here. There's not enough parking spaces. You can't have a restaurant in this location because this is designated to be specifically for clothing stores. It seems a bit frivolous, and this is where I think, in my mind, the government is overstepping. What would you say to those types of jurisdictional laws at the local level?
Sure. Zoning laws, basically.
Zoning laws, yeah.
I have thoughts, but
I'll leave this to you because this is one I haven't thought about.
Again, I think lawful power. In other words, I think the idea that a community could, through its magistrates, decide we want businesses here and homes here and churches here and sort of for the good of everybody, for the common good of the society or this little community, say we want certain things in certain places. I think that's a thing people can do. Can they do it badly? Can they wield that power in a corrupt way? Yes, just like any other power, it could be wielded corruptly to sort of privilege certain people at the expense of others. It could be onerous, and so I can imagine all sorts of ways, and have seen all sorts of ways where that power could be wrongly used. But the idea would be love your neighbor by preserving certain spaces for certain activities. That seems to me to be in bounds in principle. And then it's a question of wise and judicious application. And so even this I think is an important thing, is that laws never apply themselves. Okay, right? Like laws by their nature, like just because you have a law in the books doesn't mean, this is why.
Jaywalking, like you're typically not seeing people getting tickets for that, but they're on the books.
Or sticking a sticker on like there's been some sticker stuff that's happened. And those would be good examples of like, is it in principle, can the state say, hey, we don't want this part of town to be plastered with a bunch of stickers? Is that in bounds? I think they can, yes. To selectively enforce it in order against certain forms of speech or certain people is a misuse of that power, because but this is why, like, even with like our Constitution, like people swear an oath on a Bible to uphold and defend it because it doesn't defend itself. It's a document, right? It's a law. The law at some level is like it teaches and it informs, but unless you have magistrates to actually wisely apply and enforce it, and so then at some level, and this is why we want both. Like you want both good laws and good statesmen, because what do sinners do with good laws? Well, what did they do with God's law? This is Paul's point. It's like, right? It's like the law is holy, righteous, and good, but sin, man, watch what sin does with a good and holy and righteous law. Look at what sin will do with good laws. And so, what do you need? You actually need good men. You need wise, faithful statesmen who are going to take it and apply it wisely and judiciously for the good of everyone, and for the good of the society, and not do it to make a buck or to privilege their friends or whatever other kind of things.
I think that, go for it.
Yeah.
Different, related to a zoning question. What about laws banning collecting rainwater on your own land?
So I suppose the argument for that would be if you collect all the rainwater, then the river is going to dry up and it will affect people downstream. Would that be the kind of like, in other words, I'd want to know like, what's the, why? Like what would be if it's just like in other words, if the state said,
like, is it environmental versus like any other?
Yeah. So like basically public uses, if it's in the category of, if you take a river that runs through two states, can state A dam the river and therefore prevent the water from getting to state B and say, all this water is now ours?
Well, I'm thinking about a private home, collecting rainwater off the roof, for example.
Yeah, so I think it would, I think that the burden of proof would be on the state to demonstrate why that rainwater, collecting water, would somehow be destructive to the social good. Like you would have to, like the burden of that, I don't want to say in an absolute sense never, but I have a difficult time thinking of what possible common good interest could be served by preventing people from doing that.
When that question came up, I immediately go to a very similar type of analogy that Doug uses about building his home, where there's laws about where you can put your windows and how far apart the studs need to be, and I mean all of it in context seems like there's a reason for it. You want your home up to code, but then at the same time, if your home isn't up to code and you built it yourself or whatever, someone can come in and say, actually, you can't live here. Right. That seems wrong in my mind because it's my land, it's my property. I can do what I want. Right. There's a sense of private property. But as some of the concepts even that Lennox and I were kind of fleshing out when we were going over some of these concepts is, even if you own your own land, you've paid off your entire mortgage, you're still paying property taxes. And the moment you're done paying or the moment you stop paying property taxes, the government can step in and say, actually, that's ours, right? And so like there is this concept that the government will establish certain types of laws, whether it's municipal or whether it's tax laws or whatever. And what we have as a concept of being our own personal private property is not actually ours. And I think that's a critical problem for our society.
Yeah. So the forms of what forms of taxation actually serve the state's purposes and guard private property, I think is a really interesting one. And I don't have like great answers on it, but like because there's different things as you could tax in principle, certain ones are going to incentivize, like all taxes create incentive structures and therefore are means of social manipulation. And so you're going to, like if you tax capital gains, you're going to get less people investing because why would we invest if you're going to take more money from us? And so like there's things like that have downstream effects, and that again is why statesmanship is such and statesmanship I think is a function largely of like you have to know God's law, but then you also have to know history because you have to see how has God's law been applied in different times and different places.
How did it work?
How did it work?
Yeah.
Like how did it work out for those? It's like how did it work out for those people? It went very badly. It's like we should not do that. We should not do the thing that went badly. And so
somebody said history is one vast early warning system.
That's exactly right. Yeah, and so I think those kind of questions are why you need church. This is back to the churches preach the basics, and then you need people who are going to be like locked. Like this is what Christian statesmen, Christian lawyers are supposed to do is to like get into the weeds and figure out how to do it in the same way that a Christian plumber is going to know everything there is to know about how the plumbing works. On the residential standards kind of question. Like, again, this would be a place where the lawful power is parapet laws, saying like, hey, safety demands, and thinking probably generationally of if somebody builds the home and covers it all up, builds it on a sandy foundation and it's really junky underneath, but successfully covers it up and then sells it to you. But nothing bad happens. And then you sell it later, right? Who's liable? Like, where does how do you maintain liability? Because the idea would be it's not a problem until it is, and then somebody
Insurance companies, right?
Somebody falls to the floor, things like that, because it wasn't built well. And so the state's attempt to kind of anticipate that by standardizing things seems to me to be like it's a one way to do it. The question though, does it become onerous, and does it actually foster rebellion? I think this is one thing that Althusius makes this kind of argument. In general, he does it on religious grounds. Like, atheists are harmful and destructive to social order because they teach lies about God, right? He said, but sometimes you might be in a society that has a lot of them, and you just have to tolerate the evil because it would be more destructive to try to root them out, right? And it would be, so in other words, you might, and I think this is true of like a lot of laws that I could say, yeah, that's in bounds, but if right now the Idaho state legislator tried to pass, say, a blasphemy law, you are not allowed to blaspheme Lord Jesus. I'm willing to bet that next week, right, there's going to be lots of people who are just blaspheming Jesus to thumb their nose at that law because we don't live in a society. So part of it is like, where are the people at?
It's that Overton window.
It is an Overton window kind of thing. Yeah. That's part of the wisdom. And what's interesting to me about these kind of questions is he models this for us. Like, this is what Jesus says when the Pharisees say, why did, Moses allow for divorce? And Jesus says, well, from the beginning, it was not so. Like, it's not the ideal, but God basically budgeted for your hardness of heart, right? He gave that law knowing, and so he was like, given the hardness of heart, I will devise a mechanism for divorce. But what the Pharisees did is they took the accommodation and made it the new standard and treated it like the ideal. And why statesmen need to know this is the ideal and this is an accommodation. And we're always trying to move toward the ideal, never settling for the accommodation, never settling. We don't make peace with our sin. We don't make peace with crime.
Yeah, that's good. And I think that's a good way to bring in this question as well. Usually the definition of the state in terms of the role of the state is to praise the good and to punish the evil. Right. My question is, what role does the state have in preventing crime as opposed to just punishing? Yeah, exactly, punishing it afterwards. What sort of wisdom ought to govern the way we think about that?
What kind of crime prevention?
Yes.
Well, give me an example of the kind of things you have in mind. I'm just trying to even picture.
I mean, there's a sense in which speed limits do that. Right. That they, in the name of wanting to prevent something catastrophic happening, they set up crimes. But then again, I guess I just wonder sometimes, should that be in their scope? Should that be in their parameter? Of course, the exercise of wisdom really is the key thing in all of this. Because sometimes I think there's a good reason to exceed the speed limit. Right. And the question is, does the state have the wisdom to discern those kinds of things? But then it brings me back to the question, should that even be something the state does at all?
One thing that kind of comes to my mind just off of this real quick is like places like California that celebrate the criminal over the average citizen. You can go in and steal up to $1,000 worth of merchandise and nothing is going to happen. No, I mean, not even the police are going to do anything. What do you do in the situation in which laws are established to prevent crime, or in some places where the government is allowing crime and celebrating it? I mean, obviously you need proper application of laws, but when laws aren't even being enforced by sheriffs because it's something that they know they're not going to win at the DA level, how does a society function in which?
And the answer there is simple. It doesn't. You create policies like that and then complain when stores close and move out of the area. And you protest that and you try to pass laws to make them stay there, but they can't. I mean, it's silly. The speed limit isn't a really good example here. An example would be preventing fentanyl from coming into the country. I think that's well within the purview of the government. But I think in many cases, the prevention of crime really needs to take place away from the government. It's more a function of family and church. One of the best crime prevention programs out there is an intact family.
Yeah. Exactly.
So what should happen in an ideal world is that the church and the family should be working together. I think the state may need to play a role at this point in incentivizing intact families.
Correct.
Where we are now, I don't think the state should be involved in family life, but where we are now, it's probably necessary.
Yeah. Well, at the very least, not cause harm to it. So like if you, right, so there's ways in which, so first do no harm, but then that would be exactly what I would say. So it's like the state incentivizing husband, wife, not just, so like, and this is the thing is people will talk about, two-parent families. It's like, no, not two parents.
Husband, wife, and children.
Husband, wife, natural family. Right. State finding various incentives to like say, we want this and we want, and incentivizing children. Right. Which often people think, so you're saying like tax breaks. And I'm like, well, that'd be one thing. But I think there's even other tools in the state's tool belt. Like one of the things the Bible says is that the state should punish the evil and praise the good. So even just simply like is there a role for, so I think like right now, to the degree that statesmen, politicians are encouraging and speaking well of the family, right? Is itself like, that's a use of the state's, that's the proper use of the state's role, like modeling for people, right? And commending what is good. And then there would be other ways like and the flip side then would be that don't harm would be if the welfare state basically absolved, say, men of responsibility and incentivized single parenthood, right? You're now destroying, like that's the opposite of, that's crime enablement. It's like, it's in the same bucket as we're not going to punish, $1,000 or less. Right. We're saying that there's certain things we're just not going to punish, or we're actually now doing harm by setting up structures of society that make sin easy and make righteousness hard. And the state, which the state should be doing, we want to set up structures that make obedience easy. And that make obedience easier, right? Obedience is never easy. But I would say like Sabbath laws would be a good example of this. Like I would say wise Sabbath laws don't compel people to go to church. Like you don't have the police running down the street making sure everybody gets to church on time. But what you do say is that economic activity is going to be at best, like restricted, whether it's completely, there's works of necessity, mercy, all kinds of details to work out about you still want your police operating, you want your ambulances to show up, you may want to have some pharmacies available and certain,
essential things.
Yeah, certain essential, you can do that, but most businesses should be Chick-fil-A. And the reason is both a horizontal thing, love your neighbor by giving them the day off, but also love your neighbor by enabling them to go to church. And so you don't have to compel people to go to church in order to create a society in which church going is easier than the one we have, where people have to go, my boss says I have to come in. And it's like, that should not be. Like the state does, I think, have a role in saying, no, employers must give their employees rest. That's the function of the law in Israel. That's how it worked. And it's a creational principle.
Why the state, not the church in that specific
because
example?
Because the magistrate has care of the society as a whole. Like the church has care of its members in terms of their spiritual health and well-being. That's the word in the sacrament. But in terms of the well-functioning and well-ordering of society, that's what that God has instituted the magistrate for that purpose. And so that's why the magistrate has care. The magistrate shouldn't administer the sacraments, but should he promote the right preaching of the word? Should he encourage it and incentivize it in whatever ways by commending it, things like that? Absolutely, because he has care of the society as a whole. That would be the basic.
You touched on one aspect that I think would be really good to start to flesh out, and that is the welfare state. This goes right in line with, I think, a lot of what Glenn has written on with the slaying of the Leviathan, right? This multi-headed beast that we've created. I would like to jump into this. So let's just take the welfare state, for example. We are, I think, running a $6 trillion budget in the United States or so. And we are forecasted to have trillions of dollars in deficit, with the biggest contributor of that being welfare programs, social programs. There is this concept that again, some of the stuff that Lennox and I were kind of discussing, fleshing this out, that some of the ideas behind some of the programs make sense, but is it the government's role to be stepping in and be providing that? Let's take like food stamps or things of that nature, I guess, medical, for example. The Lord said that the poor will always be with you. And so there's this concept that there's going to be different social strata no matter what happens, no matter what the government does. But what should be the role of the government? What should be the role of the church when it comes to, being a safety net for people that could be falling through in society? Because right now, it's blatantly obvious to every American that the government cannot continue to sustain being the safety net. Is this a family issue? Is this a church issue? Is this a government issue? Is it all three? What would you folks say to that?
Yeah, this is a debate that goes back to the Reformation, as it turns out. The church, looking at the Reformed branch of the church, Martin Bucer is one of your key people starting here. Bucer would argue that part of the ministry of the church was the diaconate, which he understood as handling social welfare. However, in Strasbourg, the state said, no, handling social welfare is our responsibility. So you end up having a tug of war again over which one is responsible for doing it. You go to Geneva. They had a social welfare, pretty comprehensive, actually very impressively set up social welfare thing in the General Hospital. Calvin arrives in Geneva and says, hey, you know what you're doing in the General Hospital is what Scripture says deacons do. And he's more or less baptizes the officers of the hospital as deacons. And so this passes into the Reformed world as their understanding of the diaconate. But the question still remains, how much of this is a church responsibility versus how much of it is a state responsibility? Within the Catholic world, it was done through what were called confraternities, which are lay religious organizations, or typically the monasteries would handle social welfare things. I think actually Kuyper is really good on this, where he argues for the importance of intermediate institutions that stand as a buffer between the state and the individual. The church is one such intermediate institution, the family is, but there are other charitable type institutions that can stand there and do this kind of work. Now, this number is decades old, but I read at one point that when you give money to a charity that is working to the poor, with the poor, on the average, 35% of it went into overhead. When you go to the welfare system with the government, on the average, 35% of it went to the welfare recipient. 65% was eaten up by overhead.
Right.
Actually, no, it wasn't. Excuse me, I got the numbers wrong. It was 15% in both cases. 15% overhead for the charitable institution, and 15% actually makes it to the recipient with the state.
Wow.
So, in terms of efficiency, government is horrendous. Before the Depression, we had means of helping the poor, but it was done locally. And whether you want to call that subsidiarity, using the Catholic term, or moral proximity, which is a term from John Schneider, a theologian at Calvin, this was the way it was handled. It was handled by family. It was handled by the community, people who knew the people who were involved, knew what their real needs were, and were able to address it.
It's really a much relationship with them as well. Yeah.
And done either through family, through church, or through local intermediate institutions. It's a much more efficient system, and with the relationships and all of that, they know the situation on the ground. What we get with government is a one-size-fits-none.
And also to, I guess, contribute to that thought, I would say that when the government is just handing them fish as opposed to teaching them how to fish, that also creates a dependency upon the welfare state.
Right.
Which is, I think, where we're principally at right now.
Yeah. Well, and I'll tell you one story. When I was growing up, my mother taught in inner city Newark, in actually a special ed place. And she would periodically visit the kids. And one day she came in and mentioned that she was visiting one of her students, and the dad wasn't living in the home. And I asked why, and she said it was welfare. And I said, well, what's that got to do with it? And she said, well, the welfare system says that if the father lives at the home, the assumption is he's got a job, so they give them less money. But the problem is there are no jobs, so he had to move out so that they could have enough money to live. And I said, that makes no sense at all. And she said, well, that's the way the rules are written.
Yeah.
And people debate this all the time, but this is a concrete example from my own growing up of the way the welfare system destroys the family. Or destroyed the family, which then created the situation we've got now with fatherlessness in the inner city communities.
Right. Yeah, so I think all of those are, in terms of again, is it lawful versus is it good? It seems like what Calvin did in Geneva, where you would, or in other words, if at scale, right, a small town, Geneva wasn't that big relatively to like modern cities, says we want to address this social problem with state action, I think that's in bounds. The question of whether it's wise and good is really where the rubber meets the road, which is where the efficiency arguments, it does seem to me to pass over from simply being unwise to actually being destructive in an unlawful way to the degree that you're basically stealing. Whether that's stealing from one group of people, we're confiscating here to just give away here. Like I do think that it's there is the argument, I think taxation's lawful, okay? But there are forms of taxation which wouldn't be. And then also the generational thing. So basically the debt kind of questions where we're basically putting the burden of all of these programs on our great-grandchildren or our children or something like that.
Let's be real, the debt will never be paid.
Right. So and then it's a question of, well, okay, then what, eventually something will happen to it. And so is it bang, is it whimper? Like how does it go? How do the lights go out? And so to establish a system which basically does that, does seem to me to be that's a sin. Like you're sinning now, and therefore by institutionalizing it, now you're going crime. Right. So I think that argument could be made, even though in principle, the church and state either working together to various degrees is a wisdom call of what kind of churches do you have, what kind of state do you have, what size are you working with, and I think that's part of the challenge I think we have as modern people is that our technologies and the modern structures of society enable a scale that is hard to find historical analogies for. It's like the idea of you have a nation and it's 500 million people.
Right.
But it's one nation.
Right.
I think everybody, if you go back, anybody and said you had 500 million people, they'd go, that's called empire. I don't care. It's not, to think of it as it's a single ethnos, would break some, and it requires certain types of bureaucratic mass media propaganda in order to facilitate. No, we're one, and therefore requires mechanisms to enforce that. And so the question of just scale, I think, is a really important one to stir into the mix of what, in order to have a nation of this size, do you have to have a government that's bigger than you would like, basically, right?
So I'm curious to kind of just flesh this out a little bit more from your perspective. Do you think in the situation that, say, we're currently in right now, that it is, I guess, right, and not only lawful, but right for the government to be the actors that they are in the welfare programs in today's society?
Yeah, so I think most of them, for the kinds of reasons that whoever, so there's the two problems of once you make it a government program, you've made somebody's job depend on that problem not going away, right? If the government's going to solve a problem, as opposed to manage a problem, there's a difference. If the task is we need to fix this, their job depends on it not being fixed. Okay.
USAID.
Yeah, exactly. And so versus if the issue is the poor you will always have with you, and so we need some way of the indigent poor and not have the sliding scale, and we just need to manage that. That's a different thing that you could tie that down pretty well, as opposed to having the definition of poor expand, and all of a sudden you're redistributing wealth from different people.
People having incentives to be poor.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And
Yeah.
so, and that would be the other thing, is that the way it's managed in sort of this short-sighted way that thinks throw money at it and ignore the kind of culture, customs dimension of all of these problems. And so I would say, but how would I feel if say the Trump administration were to take advice from a guy like Brad Wilcox, who's a guy who works in family policy, and basically say, hey, we want you to design our family policies that will still require substantial government investment, but we want you to orient them to encouraging and promoting husband-wife households, right? Would I say that would be would I say, no, you may not do that, we just need to rip all of this down? I would say, I would be open to that. Like I would say that's inbounds as a possibility. It wouldn't be like whereas I think some people would say, no, the state needs to get out of all of this altogether. And that's an element of like, there's a certain kind of ideologue, that like a libertarian ideologue kind of thing, where you go and you kind of go like, yeah, wouldn't it be great if? And it's like, well, yeah, but you would need like a thoroughly Christianized society that has self-government, strong families,
A moral people,
a religious people, and then it's like, and then you can have your libertarian paradise. And it's like, but short of that, you don't, and to try to force that is not going to go well.
Exactly. Yeah. You have to start with where you are.
Right.
It would be one thing to say this is the goal, this is what we're getting to, but you've got to figure out what your steps are to get there.
Right.
And you can't get there in one giant leap.
Right.
It's just not realistic.
And I think that's where like the particularization of some of these things, that like history matters. So when I think about in principle, like I'll shift it to the blasphemy laws thing again. Historically, we've had those. Like those existed in America even, right? They were compatible with the First Amendment for 150 years. But I think there's ways in which it might be unwise to try to impose them given American developments, right? Whereas in a different society where they never stopped using them, it would be like, yeah, you could just re-up those without the same kind of disruption. And that's again, like applying it differently depending on the people. The other element of this is like, there's a difference between societies have two kind of main mechanisms of enforcing stuff. Custom and law. And healthy societies rely on custom a lot more than they rely on law, right? Formal law. So in other words, like why don't people steal? Because we don't do that. Right? Like that's not who we are. And I think that there were times in this country, for example, and I think this is downstream from this is downstream from Christianity as it was came to flower in Europe and then was brought over to America. It was like, well, we just don't do that.
Right.
And so, yes, technically there were laws that said don't steal, and they were being enforced. But the reason that most people didn't lock their doors at night was because, well, we just don't do that. That we're not that kind of people. And then what happens is as custom weakens, which mass societies weaken custom everywhere, and mass migration also is a major disruptor here. All of a sudden, you have to start relying, in the absence of custom, what's your other tool? You have to use law. And so inevitably, you're going to have an increase in bureaucracy and things like that to compensate for the absence of custom. And I think that's like one of our biggest challenges, quite frankly, as a society, is like all of our problems are caused by big government.
Right.
But we're the kind of people right now who need a big stick.
Right.
And so yes, we want Reformation revival, and it's like, how do you have the bottom up revival and the top down? Like what's the magic thing there? And I just think, man, we're gonna have to try it all.
Not too long ago, I wrote something on the correlation between an expanding bureaucracy and absent leadership.
Right.
Would it be a stretch to then say that the reason why the custom isn't recognized as more potent than even the law itself is because we don't have leaders who assume responsibility for themselves and for the people around them in bringing about cultural change? Yeah,
well, and I think, the interesting thing about leaders too is like, it made me think of this. Like there's this, so like today is an election day, like there's a Supreme Court election, when we're recording this, there's a Supreme Court election in Wisconsin. And I live in a society where I have to care about that. Like that actually, and I'm like, that should be no business of mine whatsoever. Like I should not even be aware of that.
That's like 6 states away.
It's like 6 states away. And it's like, I'm sitting there and like, stuff pops up on Twitter and people, Elon is like all in on this election because there's this recognition of like the stakes. And it's like a healthy society, I would not have to care.
Right.
The elections I would have to care about would be local. The president would be someone that'd be like, oh yeah, that guy. Yeah. Right, like that, because this is the subsidiarity thing. The most meaningful government would be the closest to you, but it's like I actually do have to care what happens in Washington, and what happens in Washington is affected by who the Supreme Court justice is in Wisconsin, because that it's like all of these different like interconnected things, but it goes to like, but your bureaucracy question is right, because bureaucracies are designed to evade responsibility. Right, exactly. Like the whole point of them is that you can't point your finger at any one person and say, well, that guy needs to get fired. And when you have a bureaucracy that runs everything, which we do, then it becomes really hard to like have accountability. And this is what like the moment we live in is really fascinating in this regard, because of what happened with Trump the first time. He's come in saying, I'm going to fix, that's the thing. I'm going after that. And now and for the first, month of his presidency, it was like executive order, executive order, executive order. And everybody's going, isn't this great? He's just, man and woman is that. And we're slashing this, and DEI is dead. Yeah. And now we're deporting all the, illegal immigrants, and especially the violent ones and all this sort of stuff. And now you're seeing the revenge of the bureaucracy and through the judiciary. Like those two institutions have now said, this is like, and so now we're like, oh, the empire just struck back. And so it's like, how does this go? It's like, I don't know, but it's like, those are the big questions of whether or not the kind of government slashing that Elon wants to do and the kind of lawful, righteous executive orders in this case that Trump wants to do are allowed to stand, or is it just government by bureaucracy?
Right. Yeah.
I think one aspect that you touched on earlier, if you had taken our population of 500 million people and talked to an individual 300 years ago, they would have said that this isn't an empire. We, in a lot of sense, especially foreign policy, do act like an empire. We're actively involved. And there's this assumption, conservatives will say, we're the leader of the free world and we have this responsibility. I'm curious to know what you gentlemen think our responsibility, or the government's responsibility, is as being a beacon, because I think it's fair enough to say that we have the immigration problems largely due to the fact that people want to be Americans. They do see this place as a place of opportunity. And so with that being the case, and us kind of traditionally, especially following the world wars, having a very active international foreign policy, what is our role, or what is the government's role? And should it be limited to a certain extent? And I think kind of touching on some of the aspects that you had brought up earlier, USAID, this has been a very hot topic issue in the last several months, with the massive cuts that have been taking place. When it comes to wars, and when it comes to, the United States giving aid to third world countries, what should be the United States' role?
Yeah, I think that the U.S. obviously should have a role in this. I think that unfortunately a lot of our role has been malevolent rather than benevolent. And I think that it has been done badly, and in many cases at least. I think that in terms of wars, we have a very clear doctrine of just war. And when the just war criteria are met, then getting engaged in a war is justified. Unfortunately, that has not been the case in many times when we have gotten involved in wars. We have not. Many of the wars that have been fought since World War II were not just wars by the historical criteria. As far as helping other countries, that is a legitimate thing for us to be doing, but I think we have not been particularly careful at the way we've gone about doing it. And along with that, in many cases, we have done it to promote particular ideological positions that were not only wrong, but hypocritical. We advocate the idea, theoretically, we advocate the idea of not imposing cultures on, our culture on other countries, and then we go about doing it. We tie conditions on aid to things that have nothing to do with the aid, nothing to do with anything righteous. We have done a lot of things very badly. I don't have any objection to helping other countries, especially when they are in need, especially when we're able to do that. I have no problem with the idea of using foreign aid as a way of promoting core national interests. These, it seems to me, are perfectly legitimate things for the government to do. These are not the things the government has typically been doing, though.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think similarly, like there's, I think in some ways, like I actually appreciate more honest empires than sneaky ones. Right. And I think it's difficult to actually be an empire if you don't have, you can't export what you don't have. And so right now, America doesn't know what it is, right? It's so what is an American is like the question, like what is that? Like if you show up here and you want to work hard, are you?
Right. Are you a woman?
Yeah.
Are you a man?
Yeah, right.
We
exactly.
can't even figure this stuff out.
And it's like, so like, and these sort of, and is America somehow unique relative to other nations in this regard? Which is kind of a typical statement that gets made is like, well, if I moved to France, I couldn't become a Frenchman. But if someone moves here, they can become an American like that. Because if they have the right creed or like this creedal nation idea. So there's this debate about what's an American. It's really difficult to then sort of export or try to do something when you don't even know the answer to that question. And I think like there's a way in which like for a long time, like the British Empire like knew what it was. Like we're this little island, but like we know what we're doing. And you may say like, yeah, but they did all kinds of evil stuff. They got involved in places and they did sort of things like, that's true. They also did a lot of great stuff. Like they ended the slave trade. Like they did. Yeah. Like the only reason that we don't have global slavery institutionalized, there's still slaves in places. The reason it's all underground now is because the British Empire, because Wilberforce said, we're done with that. And then the British Navy said, and we're going to enforce it. And so that's
Another thing I can think of there as well is just it's the way it pacified the spread of Islam.
Yeah, that's right.
Like when the British Empire started to crumble, Islam started to spread like a wildfire all over the place.
Exactly. And so there was ways, but it was like there was a cultural confidence to them. Like, yes, we know that not everybody can become British, but we're exporting British values, British ideals. We're going to try to do our, run India the way, we're going to bring some of that in there and things like that. And they didn't always do it well, and it was very corrupt. Like there's reasons that like the evangelicals who were going to India were like, the British government's the worst. They won't let us evangelize. They're doing all sorts of evil stuff, but they also ended sati. So so it's a mix. Empires are always mixed bags in this regard, but they were at least like they knew what they were doing. And so this like, we don't know what we are, but we're still going to meddle in everybody's business is just a recipe for disaster. Right. Like you're not going to make, you're not reliable. And I think that's true on the immigration side as well. Like a strong, self-confident people can say, yes, you can come here, and then you have to become us. Right. And say, within a generation or two, you can. This is what happened in Israel. Like if you wanted to join Israel, you could, but there were certain restrictions for a couple of generations until it's like you're fully in. And I think for this country, there was that expectation. So somebody could come here and say like the 1900s, early 1900s, Ellis Island type era. And the expectation was within a generation or two, we won't be able to tell the difference between your kids and everybody else. Right. Now, granted, this is all largely Europeans that were doing this, but Europe's like a very diverse continent. Like a guy from Poland, a Polish Catholic, comes to America, and within a generation or two, his kids speak English, and they have their special desserts or whatever, but they root for the Chicago Bears, just like the kid from Ireland, right, whose parents came from Ireland. So but that required a self-confident, like to be an American is a real thing, and you need to become like us. That's different than the mentality that's been present for the last 70 years. Which is very much like we're apologetic, we feel bad, and we want to build up your culture. We want you to come here and
kind of a reparation type mindset.
Yeah, and it's like fly the flag of your country, and we're gonna like say, isn't your country great? And send the money back to your country, and then it's like, but still say, but you're an American.
Right.
And it's like, that makes no sense.
Right.
My grandparents moved, all four of my grandparents moved to this country in the early 1900s. And on my mother's side, they opened a deli in Queens.
Right.
They never spoke their native language again.
Yeah.
Never.
Right.
Absolutely refused to do it. My mother never learned her parents' language.
Yeah.
And there's an element of that that's like, and that's a good example of custom, right? Like there wasn't a law that said you're not allowed to speak that language anymore. It was like there was a cultural expectation that if you want to become an American, this is what it's going to take. And there's hoops, but they're cultural hoops that was birthed out of like, we know who we are. We don't know who we are, and yet we're still doing all the things we used to do. And that's why it's going to go badly. So I think a righteous foreign policy would say, hey, let's get back to like what's good for America. Like that's your priority. And to the degree that we can also benefit others. But it's like, if you're not taking care of the home front, and if we're people, it's only a couple of $1 billion, and that's a drop in the bucket. And it's like, that's part of the problem, is that you think a couple of $1 billion doesn't matter. But
and if you don't have the ethos to back it up. Like
I was going to say, because I mean, when you think about much of the third world and much of American foreign policy towards the third world, a lot of it is just leftist propaganda. Like that. That's really what it boils down to. You want to be able to export your best ideas that would serve the highest good of other nations as well, by giving something that's actually true, beautiful, and good. You know.
So you touched on just a fascinating topic that I think is like the definition of like unlimited government, and the concept of today's episode being a limited government. When our country doesn't know how to properly enforce or doesn't have a creed or an idea of who we are anymore, but yet we live in a modern age where there's real threats, 9/11, for example, right? And we live in a digital age where everyone's on their phones and we're sending messages left and right. How does the government reconcile their excessive and very intrusive use of our information for national security purposes, and what should be a proper view of what the government should be allowed to do and not allowed to do? What can they look at? What can't they look at? That's our own personal information for the sake of national security.
That's a tough one. I feel the force of like the national security stuff. I think probably what I would say is, I think that question is more obvious if you don't have mass immigration. Does that make sense? Like, in other words, a cohesive culture and a sense of like if you're going to have an open border, it sort of is going to demand that you be intrusive to everybody for the sake of national security, because you need to be, because you didn't try to, like to the degree it's foreign threats.
That are now internal.
They're now internal, and they have, and so
no common customs anymore.
And there's no common customs in order to like, so it's the sort of thing that if you don't, and you don't have a common culture, common society, you have enclaves. You really are an empire. You have there's a ruling class, and then there's lots of there's tribes, there's little peoples, and so you're just, and then you're in a global context. So I think that the immigration thing really does distort what would be wise and good when it comes to the government's engagement with technology. So that's my first thought. Beyond that, I don't have a clear sense of but the intrusiveness is an issue. But I get it's kind of like, oh, we destroyed the family, so I guess we have to have the state step in.
Right.
It's like, well, you didn't have a border, and so now now
we have to do
the only thing I guess, unless we're going to just allow the terrorists to do the stuff, we're going to allow people to, but there's also an element of the selective enforcement of things, right? So every, right now we're in the midst of of terrorism, in the sense of every Tesla owner is the target.
Right.
And are they going to, what's going to happen? Or is it just going to be oh, well, remember when that funny summer, then that happened? Everybody kind of laughs it off the way that that was that period of time where people burned down American cities in 2020. And COVID stopped for a minute in certain places. And just the arbitrary use of it, I think that that element is actually the most destructive thing, because it's like having laws that you don't enforce, because what you're teaching is laws don't matter until they do. And this is the idea of anarcho-tyranny, where you have certain people who the laws do not apply to at all. They can do whatever. That's the anarchy side. But then other people get out of line, and you're just like dropping the hammer. Right. And it's that you're stoking rebellion at that point. Like you're demanding civil war at some point, because of your folly. Right. And so I think when it comes to the data thing, I think that ropes in, because it's like, well, if you had confidence that the state was going to only use it for certain purposes, then you might go like, I can see there's a need for this. We don't want more 9/11s. Right. But given who's actually in charge, I'm like, I don't want them to have anything.
And given the lacks of the not enforcement of the laws that are on the books, i.e. the immigration, it's like, how is there any way to vet what's taking place in this nation, without jumping into people's data?
Right. So you end up policing certain people and not others.
Yeah, and that I think is actually part of the key here, that they want certain kinds of things enforced and they don't want other kinds of things enforced, because they have their own set of motivations for what they want to have and what they don't want to have.
Wow, that's so scary to think about, because it's like, man, there's this cabal of individuals that are enforcing their own agenda. And this is the definition of, I think, the Leviathan, in my opinion, right? It's like this multifaceted, headed monster that is taking its own different personalities and shapes depending on who's running it. And
well, no, actually, it doesn't depend on who's running it, because nobody is running it per se. There is, you can talk deep state, you can call it what you want to, but there's an entrenched bureaucracy. This is the thing about term limits. People talk about term limits. Term limits don't matter because bureaucracy is forever.
Right. Interesting.
And that's actually the thing that's driving people, I think, really crazy in the government with Doge. He's trying to get rid of the bureaucracy. And those people believe they have a job forever and you can't get rid of them. And they are the ones who really run things. And it's a large, nameless, faceless entity that has its own agenda and its own priorities and things like that. And they know they're the ones who really, the people who are high up in it, they know they're the ones who really run things. The Congress passes these sort of general purpose laws, and then the bureaucracy writes exactly how those laws are going to be enforced, and they are the ones who really determine everything about what those laws really mean. Congress doesn't.
Right.
The existence of that large, unelected, entrenched bureaucracy is what really runs the country. And ultimately, I think they're the ones who not only determine what the laws actually mean, but they determine what gets enforced, what gets collected, what isn't, what information they want, and they will get it, and so on. It's just, that's what we're really dealing with. We do not have an elected government anymore.
Yes, profound. As we land this plane, gentlemen, I'll contextualize this with where I'm coming from, especially where there's this fundamental correlation between an irresponsible populace and big government. There's a sense in which that irresponsible populace is what enables tyranny, because they won't assume the responsibilities that God has given them. How do we begin to start changing and shaping the culture there in a way that will then transform the politics?
Yeah, so this is the bottom-up, top-down question at some level, and I think at some level it comes from both directions, and it's the smash mouth incrementalism applied to all of it. So Christians ought not be shy about the wielding of political power. Yes. And wise Christians need to recognize that there's limits to how you can move. And I think the analogy of the family is one I've used before. So if you have a family, imagine you've got a family that's fourth generation Christians. They've just passed down the faith, right? The kind of laws or the kinds of freedoms you might have in a family like that is going to look very different than if you have, here's somebody who just got converted. There was drugs and there was all kinds of sin, and then that family comes to Christ, it would be foolish to try to, for the second family to try to govern themselves exactly the way that the first family did. Because they don't have the muscles for it. They don't have, right? But they ought to think like we ought to try to get there. And they ought to have a generational vision for how to get there. And that's going to start with basics. So this is where like, trying to 10 Commandments kind of stuff is where you start. Like start there with basics, and whatever you can do to promote obedience in law and policy to God's basics. Love God, love neighbor, 10 Commandments type stuff. That's where you should devote a lot of your time and effort. And I think the other piece would be in your community as much as possible, because the bulwark isn't just like laws in the abstract, but it's actually thick communities where people can mature and grow and can become Christians, can be discipled, and then and they have the safety nets and the boundaries and the customs. So thick communities on a smaller scale that's the bottom up part, right? Like you need that. And then if God blesses it, then all of a sudden you get a Constantine. All of a sudden you get someone who's going to be in the position to sort of slash the stuff or start the thing or whatever it is. And you should pray for those opportunities and be ready. And so this is where the political philosophy stuff does really come into play, is you have to have a political philosophy that says we know that political power is good. We know its limits. Like we know that it can do certain things and can't do other things. But we also know that the things that it can do, people will screech if we do them. And we're not going to be steered by that. We're not going to say, no, but this is righteous. We're still going to do it. Right. Which I think is part of what we're seeing right now, is that somebody figured out that's what the state's for. It's like, if you don't have this is like Trump 2015 was like, well, if you don't have a border, you don't have a country.
Right.
And so now he's like, I'm going to make that happen. And so it's those sort of things, like in the face of all of the sabotage that you're going to get that will be required.
I was waiting for that.
Sabotage is there,
I was
man.
waiting
It's always there. But you need both. You need to have, like, if you try to just wield power from on high, it's like, it's not going to work in the end. Like you actually have to have robust communities because that's what's going to, like, it's both of those together that move the Overton towards righteousness.
Right.
Yeah. Chuck Colson was a big fan of bottom up. I mean, he really emphasized that, having been on the top. He really emphasized bottom up politics. But one of the things he said at one point, and I actually had this confirmed in a weird way in a class I taught, he said, Pentecostal Christianity is exploding in Latin America. And the reason is that you have these impoverished communities where the husbands are engaged in backbreaking physical labor, and they get paid, and as often happens in this kind of circumstance, they need to blow off steam. They go and they drink a lot of their money, and their families are in real trouble. The wife goes to a Pentecostal church. She gets saved. She comes home and she tells her husband, you need to come to church with me. They drag him to church. He has some kind of inexperience there, whatever, and they tell him, you need to stop going to the bar and drinking. You need to come home. You need to be with your wife. You need to be with your family. You need to take care of them. He starts doing this. Suddenly, he's not drinking all their money. They've got money in the home. Family life improves. They're able to feed their kids. Things get better for them, and that ratifies the church. And the neighbors see this, and they start doing this. The same process occurs. Their neighbors start, the next door neighbor, the wife starts going to the church. She drags her husband in. Same thing happens. This is the way it spreads, because it works. I told this story. I mentioned this in a history of Christianity class. I said, this is, and I had hands go up across the room. One of them said, that was my grandparents' story. Another one said, that's my parents. Another one said, that's my mom and my dad's on his way. I mean, it was amazing. That's the effect of resilient communities, or thick communities, as you call them. You start building those, and people see it's working. And you'll get opposition. I mean, you're in Moscow, you'll get opposition. But it will also attract people. And as the community builds, as it grows, as it starts producing visible results that people around it will look and say, wow, there's something happening there. It can change not just that one community, but it can change entire regions. And that's the bottom-up side of it. That's really, really critically important. And I got to say, the Pentecostal thing, it's doing great in a lot of parts of the world, but the Reformed world has got a lot more to offer in terms of the depth of what it has than what the Pentecostals have. I'm not dunking on the Pentecostals here. They're doing great work. They're doing things nobody else is doing. But there's so much more that can be offered here, and the Reformed people got it.
Right.
So that's the bottom-up part of the answer that I would add to this.
Yeah. That's very good. Well, gentlemen, thank you for such an excellent conversation. This was very rich, and I'm sure our audience is going to be very blessed by everything you've had to say. Thank you.
Thank you.